You reject the notion that American society is systemically racist, but you do say that we practice, which you've introduced a term, which is interesting, rational discrimination. That is that we do discriminate, but that there is a certain rationalism to the way we discriminate. And I think one of the examples that's used all the time is the cab driver who might be driving past a black youth in urban America will not pick them up because their experience is that a black youth is 5 times more likely to commit violent crime than a white youth. But that analysis, what does that do for the black youth who is law-abiding and isn't part of that underclass who gets passed by the cab driver?
That's a very good question. And see, I think our debate on this kind of subject is terribly polarized and irrational now, because what happens in effect is that black activists say the cab driver is a bigot. Even if it happens to be a Lebanese cab driver or a West Indian or a Nigerian or a black cab driver, acting no differently than a white cab driver, they say, well, he's just internalized white racism. So the cab driver is presumed to be a bigot, and the cab driver presumes that the black activist is just crazy because he cannot understand that all the cab driver is trying to do is get home to his wife and family. The concept of rational discrimination allows us to say that we have a distinction to be made between rationality and morality. The cab driver is acting rationally. He is trying to protect his property and security. And the law-abiding young black who's passed up by a cab is appealing to morality. What he's saying is, I have a right to be treated as an individual based on the content of my character. To which the cab driver responds, I would love to do that, but frankly, I'm not in a position to get to know my customers personally. If I could ask you about your family, about your crime rate, about whether you have a criminal record and so on, it would be one thing. So we have a tragedy. And I think what we have to do is ask whether the law-abiding African-American's right not to be inconvenienced, right to get a cab, is more important, or the cab driver's right to protect his life and his cab. And I think that in this case, it is the cab driver's right that is more important.
So you go a step further. You say that rather than focusing on the cab driver as a bigot, what this law-abiding black youth who can't get the cab ride, or in fact gets stopped unduly by the police because they have that same kind of socialization, that same experience of dealing with black violence, black crime. What he should be doing is blaming his black brethren who is a criminal, and that in fact,
or if not blaming, at least recognizing that that is the source of the problem. Look, immigrant groups have always said, for example, Italian communities living in New York would always be exceptionally angry if the grandson Vito was caught stealing or was caught involved in some crime, because they would say, look, you are giving the Italian community a bad name. In other words, you are making us all look like we are part of the mafia or part of organized crime, and we will be especially severe on you. There is absolutely no such accountability, at least on no systematic level in the black community. That the reason that the cab driver is acting this way is because the Sentencing Commission, a liberal advocacy group, recently released a study. 1 in 3 African Americans in the United States is on any given day in prison, on parole, or on probation. These are staggeringly high crime rates. And the point is, by changing those patterns of behavior, we make rational discrimination less likely. I argue that that's the best anti-racism now.
We should have governments who are race neutral, but we should allow the private sector to discriminate, to be free to discriminate. And you justify this, that this in fact will help black people. Again, help me with that particular.
Well, actually, if you, I didn't begin the book thinking that, and yet then I discovered that ethnic groups in the United States have always succeeded by helping their own guys. Ethnocentrism in that sense is good when it is harnessed for gain. So if you look at the Italians, you look at the Jews, you look at what the Koreans are doing now. You go to a Korean grocery store in Washington, D.C., and you peek in the back, 15 other Koreans. It's one way that immigrant groups have overcome their historic obstacles, lack of not speaking the language, for example. If you don't
this Korean grocery store owner is functionally practicing discrimination. He's not hiring quotas.
He's discriminating in favor of his own, and I think that that's good.
But I mean, that's happening already. You're not seeing any people saying that, the real problem with American society is that black businessmen are hiring too many white people.
No. See, what we have now is a double standard in which discrimination on the part of minorities is okay, but discrimination on the part of whites is not. The Republicans have talked about the race-neutral society, color blindness. Well, the problem with color blindness is because blacks are not competitive with other groups. If you strictly enforce color blindness in the public sector and the private sector, there would be almost no blacks at MIT. Blacks would begin to vanish from many selective professions. The irony of legalizing private discrimination is I am quite confident that there would be far more discrimination discrimination in favor of blacks than against blacks. Virtually every public company today, IBM, AT&T, Procter & Gamble, discriminates in favor of blacks, and that would continue, and I think it's okay. It should continue.
You don't think that that discrimination is a function of the kind of the government sanction that says affirmative action is good?
Not anymore. It used to be. But what's happened is that these companies and these universities have set up affirmative action sectors within their companies so that even if the government were to step back, I think many of these policies would continue. In fact, when I was a member of the Reagan administration, the government had talked about ending racial preferences, and there was an outcry. And many heads of companies said, oh, no, don't do that. Or if you do that, we will continue to do what we're doing. Affirmative action has, in that sense, become a way of life. I'm worried that if we outlaw affirmative action, a great deal of government intrusion would be required to go to private companies and force them, don't act this way, don't hire this guy instead, almost on the same scale as was required a generation ago to uproot the old discrimination.
You have no concerns that we might revert back to the old Jim Crow status where I'm a restaurant owner and I just say, well, then no black people are going to eat here?
Well, remember that the restaurant owners did that in part because the prejudices against blacks eating alongside whites in restaurants were so severe that many restaurant owners, in effect, claimed racial discrimination. They said, we don't have anything against blacks, but none of our customers would come. Well, this is, this is one way in which the world has changed. And moreover, the law in the United States basically says if you have a restaurant or a motel and you put up a sign open to the public, you are a quasi-public institution, so you are held to different standards than, say, a private company.